Hi there folks, I have a banger of a demo for you today. I'm going to talk you through Copilot Studio autonomous agent capability. So I've built a proof of concept already. I'm not going to show you necessarily how to build the full end-to-end, but I will explain what autonomous is all about in Copilot Studio, how it works, what the differences are, things to look out for, common pitfalls that I'm seeing already with folk not necessarily reading the documentation or understanding how it all works. But by the end of this, you'll be able to go away and start building your own agents to free up some of that precious time. So let's crack on with today's session. So to get things started, I'm going to explain what my autonomous agent currently does. And if you're particularly interested in the capabilities of knowledge and actions in the form of retrieval and tasks, I do have a longer form video that I did live that I recommend that you watch. This particular agent has, if we scroll down, zero knowledge. All I have turned on is the general knowledge, because at this moment in time, all I want it to do is access its training data, so the general web that it was trained on back in October 2023. I do, however, have three different actions, and those actions allow the agent to send an email, to create items in a SharePoint list, and to also get items and perform an OData query. These things are all dynamically generated based on the interaction that I have with the agent, and it's also to do primarily with the instructions. You'll see also I have a trigger. That trigger is the autonomous capability. So based on when an email arrives, we're able to trigger this agent. And unlike traditional agents where you might have a conversation via the chat pane on the right-hand side for testing, or via channel if you publish on your website or within Teams, this is all done autonomously. And this is all about Power Automate and Cloud Flows. If we go back and have a look at the instructions, this is the agent's instructions and enables you to define what those different actions might do and how they are orchestrated. It's worth knowing that these instructions might conflict with the payload that you send to the autonomous agent. So when you're testing, it's important to understand that you need to ensure you are not providing conflicting instructions. And I'll demonstrate this later on in the video. Now, if I jump across onto the Activity tab, we'll be able to see a series of different conversations that I've had with my agent. They've been either via chat, and you can see the name of the user that's been interacting with that agent, and that's me, because I've been testing and chatting away on the right-hand pane. And then we've got automated, which is based on the triggers. So when a Cloud Flow calls the action, which is execute Copilot, it sends across a payload of instructions to the agent, starts a new conversation, and then the agent will reason over those payload instructions alongside the agent's instructions to then generatively orchestrate the actions or tasks that you provided, and also reason over the knowledge in order to construct a response, carry out actions, and in my case, answer questions and send an email back to the user, as well as checking to see if the user has previously asked a question, because I'm going to demonstrate how the agent can follow up by using the conversation ID so that we can continue our conversations, keep that memory context, just like you'd have as if you were using the chat pane on the right-hand side. Now, to demonstrate what my agent currently does, if I go and ask a question down the bottom right-hand side, how can I write an expression in Power Automate Cloud Flows to format a date, today, short month, string and year from UTC Now? Remember, this is using the general knowledge that it has access to. So I'd expect, based on the activity map, it's going to have a look at knowledge. It will construct an expression, and then it will send an email to the user. But also it will check to see if that user already exists using an OData query, like it's doing here. And then if the user doesn't already exist, create an item. So if we just cast our eyes over the instructions that I've given the agent, when we have an incoming request, we'll answer the question using general knowledge. We'll always send an email to the requester with an answer using emojis and humor. We'll check to see if the user has sent an email in the past. If they have, do not create an item. If they haven't, create a new item. And then we'll use get items with an OData filter to see if they already exist, and then record the sender's email address and the conversation ID into a SharePoint list. Now, whilst I'm testing this on the right-hand side in the test pane, this conversation ID doesn't apply to my scenario. But when I do the autonomous capability, I want to demonstrate how we can pick up the original conversation ID and have that memory context which will see through the activity. So if I click in the activity tab, because I've just had this conversation, I can click on that particular conversation that I've just started, and again, I can see the activity map. This is obviously ongoing, but we can see the different stages of the thought process from that agent, and these individual actions will be charged for as part of the generative orchestration. Now, based on the current pricing model, knowledge sources are based on 2 messages, and each of these actions are called autonomous actions. So here we have 3 autonomous actions, therefore there are 25 messages each, accounting to 75 messages, of which we've therefore got 75 plus 2, which gives us 77 messages consumed for this single orchestration. When it comes to actually triggering from an email or another scenario in Power Automate, there is also a trigger cost, 25 messages for that action. Of course, this is all in preview, subject to change, and I'll include a link to the documentation that will allow you to check the current rates. So if I jump across into my email and open up the email that I've received, you can see that I've received a personalized message with an example of an expression in Power Automate showing me how to format the date in a particular format. This, of course, was not triggered autonomously. Now let's see if we can trigger the same agent autonomously, and we'll go and have a look at the activity. So in order to understand autonomous capabilities, I have an email on screen right now that's going to ask a question to my agent, who is DamoBird365, and provide me with details of similar content providers. You'll note that I have a very specific subject. It's because when testing, I have set up a subject filter on my trigger in my Cloudflow. Why have I done that? Well, I guess hands up, who's ever created an infinite loop? If you have, let me know in the comments. But ultimately, don't make that mistake. Make sure you're very careful about your triggers when you're testing this autonomous capability, because the last thing you want is to rack up a huge bill. So here, if I go and hit the send button, what will happen now is I'll expect an incoming email to my mailbox. Here it's come in, the request to my agent in effect. But if I jump across onto Power Automate, I have a flow, and that flow is based on when an email is received in that mailbox. And if I do a quick refresh, we'll hopefully see, there we go, in the last 0 seconds, I can click on that date and time. And if I go into the flow, we can see the format of our flow. It's based on that trigger. There is a filter based on autonomous test to stop that possibility of an infinite loop. And then whilst I do some things like converting the body of the email into text, I'm also doing some clever stuff to keep the conversation ID, but I'll cover that later on. The important piece to note at this point is that I'm using an action called execute Copilot, which will send a prompt, or what we're now calling the trigger payload, as you can see in the documentation, a message to our agent. And that message is the requester email is, and then the question is based on the following, and that following is based on the body of my email. So we'll go into the mechanics of this in a bit more detail, but let's just continue with our understanding of what autonomous agents are all about. Back over onto Copilot Studio, if I refresh the activity, I will have a brand new automated conversation. And if I click on that, we can see the activity map and the outcome of this particular session. And it's used the get items action to perform an OData query. It will have created an item in my list because I've previously not emailed this autonomous agent. It will have searched my knowledge sources, and then it will have sent an email by reply to my original email address with hopefully details about myself and other content providers that produce similar content. If I go into my email and bring that across, you can see we have details about myself. I have to admit I don't do much content on Power BI, but we'll accept that it is general knowledge based on its training up to October 2023. And of course, you can provide your own knowledge using that capability in Copilot Studio, but it has correctly identified the other amazing content providers, and there are many more out there too, but this has now demonstrated that autonomous capability. So rather than an end user having a conversation using a chat pane on a website or in Teams, they're able to converse with that agent autonomously by triggering a Cloudflow. And then that Cloudflow will call the execute Copilot action and send across a trigger payload, which is ultimately at the beginnings of a message to an agent. but you can also continue where you left off. So right now, this particular conversation has ended at send an email. So if I fire up my email again, I have a brand new email, again using that subject filter for autonomous tests, and I have a follow-up question about Lisa Crosby and Daniel Christian. If I hit the send button on that, again, if I go into my email, I can see that incoming customer request. Over onto my flows, if I have a look at that flow run history and do a couple of refreshes, we can see again that request has come in. And if we look at that execute Copilot, we have a new payload request that's gone through to our agent with the new question. Now, the interesting thing about this particular run is you'll also note that I've passed in a conversation ID. And the conversation ID is actually the conversation ID of the original request. And the reason that I have that conversation ID from the original request is that I ask my agent to create a record of the conversation ID if it doesn't already exist. And then in my cloud flow, when I trigger based on an incoming email, I have a get items. And that get items has a filter where the email is equal to the incoming email to see if we have a note of the previous conversation ID. So this is the logic that I was just talking about. You'll see in the compose, I have the conversation ID. And if I jump across onto my SharePoint list where I currently store this information, and I've got some sample data on screen, if I refresh that, we can see my email address, the conversation ID, and my original request, because that's the data that my agent captures autonomously based on the instructions and the actions I've given it, so it can complete those tasks autonomously. If I jump back across onto my activity map, you'll see that currently I just have those 4 autonomous actions. But based on it being refreshed 6 minutes ago, if I refresh that, we'll see that it's now got an extra 2 steps, which is again to search knowledge and to send a follow-up email. If we have a look at the activity map drop down here and the transcript, we can see the first question that was asked, followed by the second question. And again, if I go into my email, I can bring that up on screen. We can see we have details about Lisa and Daniel, as well as, again, other content providers based on that original email. So not only have we now demonstrated the concept of autonomous agents, we've also demonstrated how we can follow up on existing conversations with our agent that have occurred autonomously by capturing the conversation ID and also passing in that conversation ID into the execute Copilot action when we trigger our flow from an incoming email. So I'm going to talk about some common problems that I've seen with autonomous agents so far in terms of setting them up incorrectly or maybe not understanding the documentation. But you'll see, based on the documentation that's on the screen right now, in order for your agent to respond autonomously, you need to first publish it. So whilst you can test in the test pane autonomously and you can retest previously triggered actions in Copilot Studio, if you haven't published your agent, you will not see the activity map. The activity map will not show those automated conversations. If you've already published your agent and you're getting the automated messages come up in the activity tab, but your agent is not completing the activity, then it's worth noting that triggers can only make use of maker credentials. And it's the same sort of concept as run as. You need to make sure that any actions, any flows that you add into your agent have the maker's credentials. And that's an important consideration because ultimately anyone that is able to trigger that agent autonomously now has access to the data or the flows autonomously. In order to understand where that capability is, if I go into my actions, and I have these 3 different actions here, if I go into my send an email, the end user authentication on this particular action is set up based on the Copilot author. Out of the box and by default, it's based on user authentication. If you've kept that default and you try to trigger your agent autonomously, it will fail because you're not able to capture the context of the user that triggered that flow in order to log on and run this action. Therefore, you must set it up with Copilot author authentication. In terms of debugging that, again, if you go back to your activity tab and have a look at automated, the best place to spot these errors is on the activity map, on the drop down, into the transcript. If you have any errors relating to connections, or indeed I've seen scenarios where the content filtering is blocking your agent, these will appear within the transcript and help you understand where things are going wrong. If I jump back onto the Overview tab and scroll down to where we have those triggers, these of course are based on you creating a flow. So you add a trigger, you create the flow. We have this test trigger, and these are all based on the flow run history. So every time you've run your flow, you can rerun that particular flow, but see the outcome within the test pane on the right hand side. So for instance, if I go back to the activity, I can see that at 11:50, if we have a look at the activity map and the transcript, that I requested information about who Damo Bird was. If I go back to the overview, I can go back to my Flask here, the test trigger, and choose the 11:50. If I start the testing, that will all unfold on the right hand side, and we can retest that outcome, but by using the test pane and watching the activity map unfold. This will allow us to evaluate that our instructions are working correctly, and also that our agent is therefore doing as we expect based on the actions that we provided and the various knowledge sources. So as a top tip, in order to help you with your testing, make sure you've published, make sure you have your connections on your actions set up appropriately, so it's based on the Copilot maker, and then let's just go and build a very basic triggered flow to show you how we can execute that Copilot action. So we're going to add trigger. At this point, there are only 9 triggers available, but remember, this is ultimately Cloud Flows. And actually what I would say is you can swap out the trigger and use something like a manual trigger. And that's exactly what I'm going to demonstrate. So I'm going to choose the recurrence for the purpose of creating the initial flow. We'll let it sign in, hit next. I could go make some basic changes here, but let's create the trigger and then go and edit our Cloud Flow in Power Automate. So with the trigger now complete, we can see it's added into the triggers section. I can click on the ellipsis into Edit in Power Automate, and we can see we have that recurrence trigger, which if I right click and delete, I can add in a trigger and search for manual, replace that trigger. And again, as part of testing, I quite like to add in a couple of input parameters. In this case, one for an email and one for a question. And this will allow me to manually test the Cloud Flow and check the activity. So over on Send a Prompt, if we have a look at the Copilot property, that is based on the name of the agent that we're looking to send this payload instructions across to. Under the advanced parameters, you have the conversation ID. And whilst I haven't used the environment ID yet, if anyone knows the answer to that, please let me know in the comments below. But here you can provide that message, which is our instruction payload, to our agent. And rather than saying use content from, I'm going to say here is the requester email. Provide the dynamic content from my trigger here, and the user's question is, and again, grab that dynamic content for the question. In terms of testing and understanding that conversation history, if you really want to, you can add in an action here for compose, and you can use the dynamic content for the output of the conversation ID, which will allow you to copy that and then paste it in for a second run. So what I would do there is I would add in an extra input here. We can call this the conversation ID. We can go into the ellipsis and make it optional. And then if we go back into the send a prompt, we can go and add in the dynamic content for our conversation ID. And if we go ahead and test this now, when the trigger pane opens, you can see I can supply an email address. I can add in my question. What can you tell me about Copilot Studio? And we can keep the conversation ID empty. Now before I hit the run button, because I know that my agent can capture the conversation ID, if I jump across onto my SharePoint list where I have the previously captured conversation ID, if I delete that, there'll therefore be no history of the previous conversation ID. If I then run my flow, we can see that the execute Copilot has sent through my request to my agent asking for details about Copilot Studio. If I go into my compose, we have that conversation ID, which I can copy to my clipboard. If I bring up my email, I can see that I have an email that says this is the details about Copilot Studio. And if I go across onto my Copilot Studio and have a look at the activity, I can see that I have had an automated activity. And if we have a look at that and have a look at the transcript, again, we can see the incoming request. Now this is a brand new conversation based on the activity map. If we go into that list and refresh, we can see the conversation ID that's being captured and the particular request and response, information about Copilot Studio. And if I go back into that test flow and test this flow again, we have those input parameters where I can provide my email address again. I can ask a follow-up question. What can you tell me about autonomous agent capability? I can insert the conversation ID this time round, and therefore we'll have that conversation context. And when I run that, the execute Copilot action will send a follow-up instruction to that original conversation based on that conversation ID. I've got an email based on autonomous agent capability, and if I go into my activity and refresh this particular activity map, we can see that there's been a couple of extra actions based on the knowledge sources and sending a follow-up email. So obviously the ability to use a conversation ID is not necessarily a requirement for all scenarios, but imagine where you want to follow up a question to a customer, asking them for additional information. Having the conversation ID and being able to bring that straight back into your original conversation with your agent could be useful. And I imagine the scenario of a customer asking for a refund or asking for information about their order, failing to provide their order details. The agent can send an email back to the customer asking for those details, and then on receipt of those details, looking up the original conversation ID and jumping straight back into where it left off. So I'm hoping from today's video that you've understood now the concept of autonomous agents. You understand how to implement this in Copilot Studio, some of the pros and cons to look out for, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to seeing what people are able to create using Copilot Studio and working through the retrieval, task, and autonomous capability. Now, if I haven't heard from you before, make sure you leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed, of course, like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you again soon. Cheers.